Good evening. Welcome to the Ball State University Second Convocation. Permit me to make an observation. If you didn't know anything about Shirley Chisholm, you probably wouldn't be here tonight. If my assumption is proper, there is little need for me to tell you that she was born in Brooklyn, received her early education in Barbados before returning to Brooklyn to complete her education, where she received a degree from Brooklyn College and received her master's degree from Columbia University in Education. There would be little need for me to tell you that she is a teacher by profession, and prior to entering public life on a full-time basis, became educational consultant for the Division of Daycare, Bureau of Welfare for the City of New York. There would be little need for me to tell you that she served a political apprenticeship in ward politics many years before she was elected to the New York State Assembly in 1964 and re-elected in 1965, 1966. Oddly, but due to reapportionment, I understand. There would be no need for me to tell you that she was the first black woman congressman elected in 1968, subsequently elected in 1970, re-elected, pardon me, 1970 and 72. There would be little need for me to remind you that she was a serious contender for the Democratic Party's nomination for President of the United States in 1972. I need not remind you that she is the author of 2 books, Unbought and Unbossed, and The Good Fight, which describe her life and political activities. I need not recite to you that she has been the champion of a number of causes for those groups in society which are or underrepresented in government. I need not remind you that her story of political success serves as a hope to all persons who might aspire to a political career but see a closed political system. And I probably need not describe for you that she has been defined as the people's politician and sometimes as a revolutionary within the system. Since I don't need to tell you all that, I won't. It's certainly a pleasure to present to you Shirley Chisholm, Member of Congress.
Ladies and gentlemen, students, faculty members, I'm very glad to be here this evening. I'm glad to have the opportunity to share with you my thoughts on the status of our nation and the implications of the Watergate situation and the effect that it is having on our lives presently and will continue to have on our lives unless we have some changes in government. I need not tell you that all of the persons gathered here this evening will not agree with many of the things that I stand for or that I believe in, or many of the issues or the ideologies that I perhaps do follow. But I do speak to you on the basis of my own experiences, on the basis of the stimuli to which I have been exposed, and therefore because people have different kinds of experiences and are exposed to different stimuli during the course of their lifetime, it means that there must be room for healthy dissent and healthy disagreement. I need to say to you further that I'm not here this evening to engage in any type of partisan demagoguery, that I'm here to give to you the facts of many situations confronting us in this nation today, and because some persons might belong to a particular political persuasion, might feel that Mrs. Chisholm will speak in that particular manner because what should you expect? After all, she is a Democrat. I apologize neither for the Republicans nor the Democrats, because there has been corruption and immorality and amorality within our political system on the part of both parties from time to time. So therefore, all I give to you this evening is the facts. And if you are big enough and broad enough to understand the facts and thus gather the truth shall set you free in mind and body. It is most refreshing to have the opportunity to be away from a particular city of sin at this moment on the Potomac River called Washington, D.C. Our nation's capital today stands fully engulfed and mired down in a constitutional crisis of unparalleled proportions as the administration of government finds itself suffering from a credibility gap which is deeper and wider than the gorges of the Grand Canyon in Colorado. This young but very tired country of ours has suffered and endured a great deal in nearly 200 years of its existence, but never before has it been confronted with the constitutional and moral leadership crisis which it faces today. For today, the United States stands almost rudderless and leaderless. Everyone cries out for the truth and facts surrounding the Watergate affair. The polls show that those desiring the president's impeachment or his resignation are nearing a majority. But yet the United States Congress, caught in the fear of acting and doing so swiftly, only further contributes to the crisis of leadership in our country. My friends, in any other nation, especially under the parliamentary form of government, the president and his administration would have been turned out of office. No electorate would have tolerated this lingering in office to the domestic detriment within our country. And the people of this country have been given every conceivable reason to be distrustful and reject his continued presence in office. Even his closest and some of his most long-time supporters have joined in a swelling chorus calling for his resignation. Senator Brooke of Massachusetts and conservative Senator Peter Dominic of Colorado have taken the leadership in the Republican Party in calling the nation's attention to the crisis of confidence that is now raging in the White House. Several well-known conservative columnists who have stood by President Nixon in many of his very darkest hours, now they too call for either impeachment or resignation. What does this all mean? It means clearly that our president, whose popularity is down to an all-time low of 32%, can no longer effectively govern this nation. It is not a question of governing this nation. It is a question of governing this nation effectively. It means that many of those in his own party have begun to reject his limp leadership and desire to disassociate themselves from him and the corrupt administration. And the nation at this point can only question in a most serious way Richard Nixon's steadiness of mind and his ability to stagger on a day-by-day basis. This country cannot afford limping presidencies. If we as a people ought to regain a rightful sense of priorities and any appreciable stature in the world community, the state of affairs must change. This nightmare which plagues us has stifled and indeed now fully crippled progress, what little we were making in the entire area of our social concerns. Let us not gather here tonight, however, and heap the rhetoric of just plain criticism on a beleaguered president in an unjust manner. Let us not, however, engage in partisan demagoguery, but let us instead look at the facts. Let us call the roll of those who were brought into this administration on a wave of law and order and abused their authority. John Mitchell, former law partner, Attorney General of the United States, campaign manager, and closest political advisor, already indicted and still under further investigation. Maurice Stans, rich Wall Street financial wizard, Secretary of Commerce for the United States and finance chairman of the campaign, already indicted and still under further investigation. John D. Ehrlichman, czar of domestic policy for the nation, already indicted and still under further investigation. H.R. Haldeman, keeper of the keys, as White House Chief of Staff. And the roll goes on and on and on. And now even to the distaff side of the White House, to the President's own personal secretary, who must win the prize for acrobatic ability in stretching from her typewriter to the tape recorder. And what about these tapes? They have formed the basis for the greatest loss of confidence and credibility. How stupid must our president think the American people are to continue day after day, week after week, month after month, to believe the fantastic explanations and endure this historic insult to our intelligence. My friends, this has gone far enough. The administration, by facts and statistics and voluminous testimony and voluminous revelations, overt and or covert, is morally corrupt and ethically bankrupt. Talk about images for the American people. We talk about having images on the top levels of government for our young people to be able to follow as examples. But I want to bring to you tonight a warning of pragmatism and realism. Watergate and the horrible nightmare it has become for all of us, if not now, if it ever was, a joking matter. The effect of this scandal has now begun to seriously impair and even cripple the most unsuspecting areas of American life. The crisis of energy. The energy crisis which now confronts us is perhaps the most dramatic example of my warning to you. so preoccupied with crime and law and order that the government failed to provide any long-range and substantive planning to avert an energy crisis. Most apparently, while there were plans to spy on political candidates and tape the personal conversations of public office holders, there were no plans to avert a crisis of energy, which is now threatened to put more people out of work in what has already risen to a high rate of employee layoffs. In fact, my friends, there are some higher-ups in the administration who have honestly tried to convince our president of the gravity of this crisis and have even predicted secretly a projected unemployment figure of as high as 14% in the next 5 months. And apparently, while there were plans for a White House plumbers unit, there were no plans for an employment worker security unit to safeguard the jobs of thousands during a crisis of energy. This is borne out in the fact that the president's own energy advisor, now fired, Governor John Love, said that he could not convince our leader of the true seriousness of this situation. The president have yet to come to the nation and to tell all of us the long-range program for sacrifice which we must make in this crisis. He has yet to come before us and lay forth the projections for rationing and allocation, and, my friends, more importantly, the projected rates of unemployment. There seems to be no promise of a better day right now, for with each new day, another development unfolds itself, and the crisis worsens. And then, where are we? Where are we, the people, in all of this? Where are our voices? Where are our cries? We as Americans tend to have conveniently short memories. Who talks anymore about the fact that for the first time in the history of this nation, a vice president was forced to resign because he was a criminal? Less than 90 days ago, Spiro T. Agnew resigned in what would seem to be a rather earth-shaking experience for a nation. Yet no one even talks about it anymore. So you see, my friends, it comes back to you. It all comes back to those in whom the power in a democracy is vested. You must decide where this nation is to go, for it is clearly evident that the politicians have neither the will nor the desire. The disastrous performance of the economy today can be largely understood as the result of the big business orientation of this government and its utter disregard for the critical problems of the consumer, the elderly, the worker, and the unemployed poor. Millions of low-income Americans have deeply suffered from the administration's handling of the economy, and the recession has, of course, begun already to create very tragic side effects: increased crime, increased welfare rolls, and widespread despair among the poor and the unemployed of America over the moral intentions of this administration. And more Americans now realize how close is the alliance with the huge corporate interests. It took us about 6 months to realize very markedly how close the alliance is with the huge corporate interests of this country in recent days. But they remember clearly when 6 days after his inauguration, our president announced that the government would not intervene in price and wage discussion. They remember very clearly when the administration calmly admitted that an increase in unemployment in America would be necessary to reduce inflation. And the result of this was a passivity towards the rich on the one hand, and the incomprehensible cold-bloodedness towards the worker and the poor on the other hand. It has been the worst possible economic crisis, virtually complete economic stagnation, increased and continuing inflation, record high unemployment, the first trade deficit in our country since 1893, and a huge balance of payments deficit, a world monetary crisis, and forced the valuation of our dollar. The economic record is very clear, and its statistics are appalling for the average American taxpayer. The cost of living in our nation has risen at a rate double that during the previous administration. Food prices have skyrocketed. The cost of owning a home has soared. Medical and hospital costs have shot beyond control. The policies have caused the largest increase in unemployment in over a decade. An increase from 3.5% to over 6% of our labor force, or 2.25 million jobless workers. The unemployment rate for construction workers is more than doubled because the policies of the Housing and Urban Development Agency within the President's cabinet has seen fit, because of inflation, to reduce the necessary funds for the building of homes and houses for low-income and middle-income citizens. And so if there is no work, the construction persons in this country cannot work. The unemployment rate for manufacturing and technical employees has almost doubled because, in terms of our ludicrous foreign policy, we have moved hundreds of our technical and electronic plants from the northeastern section of this country abroad into Taiwan and Formosa and Hong Kong, because the labor there of the people is much cheaper, and so they can reproduce the kinds of equipment that the American people need on the basis of slave wages in another country in order to avoid the wages that must be paid to the American citizen. And so the unemployment rate in this area has doubled. There is little sign that this aloof administration has any real concern for the personal impact of unemployment in terms of your relatives out of work. And while prices have soared and the low-income worker has lost his job, the bungling continues. The industrial production index fell steadily during the past 3 years. The real gross national product declined, and the cost of borrowing has risen at an alarming rate, with interest rates soaring to the highest level in 100 years. My fellow Americans, at the root of it all is the unique, privileged relationship which our government has enjoyed with the nation's giant corporate and industrial interests, whose arrogant power has for far too long been permitted to control Washington and thus to control all of our lives. in the time-honored Republican tradition, I guess, of what is good for General Motors is good for the country. And the administration refused to act. Then at the outset of its first year in office, big business coolly and confidently proceeded to announce huge price increases immediately when it got into office in a wide range of products. And as the prices began to rise along the entire economic front, then the administration began to cut back on government spending in an effort to cool the inflation. But which were the programs to be cut? The programs that were to be cut were the programs that have to do with the conservation and preservation of the most important resources that any nation ever has, and that is its human resources. So the programs that were cut were federal assistance to libraries and related community services, education centers, aid for handicapped children, bilingual education, community health centers, medical libraries, and jobs after jobs in all of these vital fields were abolished, and people were thrown out of work. And at the same time, the government was energetically pushing some enormously expensive programs benefiting its big business constituency, the ABM, the SST, the C5A, and the unjustified subsidies for the conglomerate and the corporate farms in this country. By slashing the domestic programs that would benefit the little people, by continuing the 10% income tax surcharge, and by its tight money policy of high interest rates, the government at last reached the point where it sacrificed on the altar the ambitions and energies of millions of low-income Americans, those who could least afford to bear the burden of such a sacrifice. And with the administration destroying any hope for improvement, Congress acted. Congress passed a law to provide hundreds of thousands of immediate jobs to the unemployed, and the president vetoed it. Congress passed a bill to provide daycare centers for children whose mothers could then join the workforce, because everyone is saying in this country they don't want to work, they want welfare. And even the poorest of the poor in this land have pride and dignity and desires to work. So the daycare bill was passed so that these persons not only can work to sustain themselves and their families, but they can also make a contribution to the tax rolls of this country and be productive citizens in this representative government. And the president vetoed that bill also. And then they turned right around and, showing where their true interests lie, acted to give billions of dollars of tax relief to business via the 10% investment credit, on top of the $4 billion a year depreciation reform. So therefore, how can you sit this evening and say that I am appearing before you in the role of a partisan demagogue when I've been unreeling to you the facts on the books? The economic philosophy of this administration is based on the principle that the business of America is business. This is an administration which has ignored the social and the psychological costs of its policies to the common man. It is an empty shell, the tool of slick advertising techniques, the prisoner of narrow political allegiances, and the faithful servant of those privileged and powerful economic interests which systematically block every attempt to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor in this country. The values and sense of social relations have constituted a fatal obstacle to any hopes for real social and economic progress in America at this moment. A government that is heavily dependent on a small clique of corporate millionaires, industrial polluters, and privileged power brokers can never be seriously expected to concern itself with the daily problems of the poor, the elderly, the unemployed, or the elderly pensioner. No administration can be so indissolubly connected to the interests of big business and special interests and still work to eliminate its crisis of credibility and moral intent among millions of Americans. All over this country, professional politicians and ordinary citizens are waiting anxiously to see what is going to happen to the Republic. Fear and skepticism seem to be the strongest emotions one detects in the national mood. There is fear for one's own future on the part of individual plain citizens. And most of all, one feels fear and uncertainty about the future of our country as a whole. And this deep-seated mood of apprehension is not an overnight development. We've all felt it for quite some time, but we've felt it in different ways. It existed during the presidential campaign, and quite possibly it was the reason why the voters chose Richard Milhous Nixon for president, because all of us may now remember one of his campaign slogans, "Feel safer with Nixon." And perhaps you also remember the theme of the inaugural address, "Bring us together." A feeling of frustration exists almost everywhere. I can see it and I can feel it in Washington. Members of Congress are frustrated because they cannot act effectively under the smothering, crippling system of seniority that controls their legislative actions. And no amount of dedication or persistence on the part of many of the gentlemen in the United States House of Representatives can prevail against the handful of old, powerful men who exercise absolute control over the machinery of the legislative branch of government. There is widespread frustration among the legions of men and women who came to Washington in response to the new feeling that John Fitzgerald Kennedy had inspired, a feeling that government might after all be a creative and a productive force. They're everywhere in executive agencies and in the offices of congressmen and committees on Capitol Hill, and everywhere they feel the same mood. They can't do the things that they know must be done. In part, they are frustrated not by the lack of laws to work with, but the principal handicap is the lack of courage, the lack of concern, the lack of compassion, the lack of commitment. The budget reductions for fiscal year 1973 1974 have cut a veritable path of destruction in such areas as poverty, education, health, manpower training, minority business, and even so-called law and order, one of the most tarnished slogans. Finally, let me warn you that the vaunted revenue sharing program, it may not necessarily lead to more services to the poor or to you, the people, because the best evidence so far indicates that cities are not spending revenue sharing funds for services to the poor. On the contrary, indications are that monies which the cities are getting, these monies are going for services and tax cuts favorable to middle income groups. In Los Angeles, if you want to follow me through, write these cities down so that you will learn to do some homework the way I do. In Los Angeles, Chicago, Providence, Boston, and New Orleans, the mayors are using their revenue sharing dollars to stave off property tax increases or to provide administrative services, in spite of the fact that many of these mayors owe their elections in large measure to poor people's votes. Let's not kid ourselves. Revenue sharing, like so much else that's coming out of Washington, D.C. nowadays, is a good way to help those who are not so badly off. It is no way to help the poor. This then is the policy. Write off non-white minorities and poor people in this country. In the face of such moral bankruptcy, our only hope is to stick together for our mutual survival. Because it is true that our ancestors may have come to this nation for different reasons, coming across the Atlantic because they were fleeing political, economic, and or religious persecution. And all of these ancestors of ours came over because they heard of a place called America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. And they came and they were able to realize some of their aspirations and hopes and ambitions that they were not able to realize in their own homelands. Blacks came over, but blacks came over for a different reason. They came over on the slave ships to provide the back-breaking slave labor that was necessary in the cotton and tobacco fields of Georgia and Alabama to help make this country become the great mercantile and financial center that it is today. So blacks came over too, but for different reasons. So we came over on different ships, but we're all in the same boat right now. In conclusion, let's ask God to guide us and to guide this troubled nation. And for the moment, just let us consider that the remaining 3 years of the administration is perhaps, if it continues for the remaining 3 years, nothing more than a troublesome detour off the main highway we were traveling towards complete freedom in this country for all people. I thank you for this opportunity. We will now have a question and answer period. When the questions are asked of me, the gentleman would repeat the question so that everyone can hear it, and then I would attempt to answer it. The questions do not necessarily have to pertain to the remarks that I shared with you this evening, and I hope that I haven't unduly upset too many people.
The question is, do you see any reform in the unjust marijuana laws of this country?
I do foresee some reform in the marijuana laws of this country, but I do not see reform in terms of a national piece of legislation that would be applicable in the same equitable fashion to all of the states. I think that the legislation that might be coming forth will probably be state legislation. I have the feeling that states are going to hold on jealously and zealously to this whole question of drugs in our country and how do you regulate drugs. But I foresee reform. I really do.
I'll try to summarize some of those because I'm not sure I can remember them in full. The question is, would you comment on the Supreme Court decision on the legislation? All right. Pardon me. On the constitutional amendment to alter the Supreme Court decision on abortion.
There's a very powerful drive on nationwide.
You say it costs so much money to be a presidential candidate. What is your solution for seeing that corruption doesn't
Occur? Yes. Now I'm going to say something that you all may not agree with, but please try to hear me out. In this country, we, the American people, only get excited every 2 years or every 4 years when it's time to go gung-ho behind a candidate. We begin to get into groups, we begin to work and, what have you. And we don't have a continuing, sustained interest in the politics of our country like people do in other countries. We really don't. Americans couldn't care less about politics. They only get interested when the races come. Now, if we do not become more interested in our politics by recognizing that in order to have people in this government who are going to be directing our destinies answerable to us, we will have to have public financing of elections. You must understand, and we must understand, that if elections are becoming so expensive in this country that you cannot run, that the first criteria must be, have you got the money? It hasn't got anything to do with the capacity or the brain power, because if you have the money, you can get the Madison Avenue boys to put you together, you can get the speechwriters to put the speech onto your face. That isn't the point. You've got to have the money. Therefore, if that is the case, when people put thousands and millions of dollars into a campaign, my fellow Americans, they're not putting it in for naught. They will be, and they have to be taken care of. And whatever is left over will come to you. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Now, we have a Watergate situation in America. We're going to have future Watergates, perhaps not as big and not as vast, and perhaps the tentacles won't be extended so far, but unless the American people begin to put their hands in their pocketbooks and begin, even if you do it through a tax deduction or whatever, unless the American people begin to support the men and women that they want to govern them, we are not going to be any better than we are today 50 years from now. 50 years from now, if I'm still alive, I'll be back here telling you the same thing. But Americans don't want to do that. And Americans don't want to do it for the most part because of their attitude towards politics. See, Americans say politics is dirty business. And because they regard it as dirty business, they're not going to put their money into that dirty business. Well, this dirty business controls the water you drink. This dirty business controls the air you breathe. And you get what you deserve. So if it's dirty business and then the millionaire corporations give the money and control the power, the vacuum was there because you, the people, said it was dirty business. So what do you want? You can't have your cake and eat it too. So until the American people begin to realize and understand that they're going to have to support the candidates, and then the candidates will have to be answerable to them, not answerable to all of these other groups that really put the money in, we're not going to make any change. I don't care how many reform laws they put on the books or how much legislation they write. If politics continues to be as expensive as it is in this country, you're not going to be able to, to bring about the change. The American people are going to have to reassess their attitudes towards politics. And I can understand their attitudes towards politics. I'm not saying I don't understand it, but that's also part of the problem. We are also part of the problem.
Right. We got two going. Right here.
How come the government hasn't controlled the war on drugs? Is that what you're talking about? Is that right? Yes, I want to be sure. Look, drugs is one of the most profitable businesses in this nation. Drugs is one of the most profitable businesses in this nation. Therefore, it isn't the little people that are pushing them in the community, pushing the drugs in the community. It isn't the boy or girl or the man or woman that's standing up nodding on the corner, hardly ever getting to the ground. Many, many persons are associated indirectly with drugs in this country, who lead extremely respectable lives. I don't want to talk anymore about it publicly. That's all I'm going to say to you. You take it from there.
Every 5 years. How do I feel about what? Well, in the first place, the consensus is of the Judiciary Committee. All right. All right. All right. The first point with respect to the Judiciary Committee for impeachment, I think it's a foregone conclusion that the Judiciary Committee, would get the number of votes to bring the impeachment resolution to the floor. But the important thing is that once it gets to the floor, what happens to it? And I sincerely believe that they will not get the votes. They will not get the votes in that House. Every congressman during the recess went home and
when his constituents pressed him or her too much about what are you doing about impeachment. I put in a resolution. It's the easiest thing to drop a resolution in and what have you. But then the people need to follow up and tell them, well, you make sure when that resolution gets to the floor, you vote for it. Because most of them have no intentions of voting for it. They lack the courage, to do it. They're putting resolutions. They do the right thing to satisfy the American people back home in the districts. All right? Now, the third thing about Thomas Jefferson, I don't think it needs every 20 years, because I'm not going to take away from old Tom Jeff what he believed in and how he felt, because I think Jeff might be rolling in his grave right now if he saw what was happening to the Republic. But I feel this way. You can't do anything unless people are ready for it. You can't inflict an alien movement or alien maneuvers or what have you on people, first of all, who are frightened, who are scared of their own shadows. So, with respect to Thomas Jefferson, I feel that you don't have to wait for every 20 years. That is my feeling. You don't have to wait for every 20 years. That if we, the American people, had guts, courage, conviction, conscience, morality, really believe in Judeo-Christian ethics without mouthing it, we would do what we had to do. Less time than every 20 years, but we don't have it. We are cowards, basically. As a people, we are basically cowards. We will move when the pack moves, but somebody has to have the initiative. There are very few people that will take the lead and what have you. So therefore, all I'm saying is that the American people don't move that way. Where's the guy? Where's the person? Yes. Sure, I would run. I would run again. I tell you, I'm not saying that facetiously. I'm saying that to say this, that many people who really believed that when I ran in the first place that I must have been some kind of a nut, or I must have been on an ego trip, or, she wasn't going to the end, or she won't be able to debate with Humphrey and Muskie and all of those other people. They had all of their preconceived ideas about a black woman going up against all these powerful white males. They saw me in action and they saw that I went to the end. And they realize now that I was very serious about what I was attempting to do. So I've gotten thousands of letters from people all over the country saying, look, we didn't go for you in the first place, not so much because you were black, or not so much because you were a woman, but because you were a combination of two and you weren't going any place, you weren't going to go to the end. Come again in 76 and give us a chance. God, we really found out the kind of woman you are, and we'd like to give you one vote, just one vote. So therefore, on that basis, and the challenge, I would do it again if I had the money. But I don't even think about it. Don't even think about it. It's out of my mind because I know I will never get that kind of money, the kind of money that's necessary. Okay?
Question back here.
Pardon? Oh, the socialization of medicine. Whether we like it or not, we're moving in the direction of the socialization of medicine in this country. I don't know whether or not the people realize it, but the fact that the president signed into law the health maintenance organizations, that is the beginning of a form of socialization of medicine, where the people in the community will be able to get all of their services under one roof, and where you would have the technician and the doctor and the person who administers the anesthesia and everybody under one roof to help in terms of the medical services that people live in a given community. That is the beginning of a mild form of socialization of medicine. And I think because it costs so much money to be sick nowadays, that the government is going to have to engage itself in some kind of national plan. And once the government begins to move in the direction of a national plan, it means that the government will begin to move in terms of a kind of socialization plan. It's the same thing that happened to education in this country. At one time, education was viewed as a privilege. Now education is a right. It became a right because of the development of our common school system. Way back in the 18th and 19th century, the only people in America that could go to schools were those who could pay. And in a democracy, an education should not be a privilege but a right. And so it has become a right. In a democracy, health care should not be a privilege. It should be a right. And so therefore we had the socialization of education in this country, and we're now moving towards the socialization of health. And on this note, I would have to say good night to you. Thank you. You've been very gracious and very kind.